Hello, I'm Lauren Bowen. I work as the Provost or the Senior Academic Officer at Juniata College, and I want to take this opportunity to describe to you the program prioritization process that Juniata has undergone over the past year or so under my leadership. I want to share with you our process, the data that we gathered, pursue its implications, and in so doing, talk about some of the decisions that I needed to make and talk about next steps and a path forward at Juniata. I appreciate your time and your attention. I want to describe for you the program prioritization process that's taken place at Juniata over this past year. The work was charged by the Board of Trustees and the President, and I was asked to chair the committee. The committee included 8 faculty coming from the arts and humanities, the social sciences, and the natural sciences. They were elected by their peers, and I had the opportunity to appoint several additional members to ensure that we had breadth of perspective and experience. And so we had faculty from large departments, from small departments, faculty who were relatively senior, holding the rank of professor, faculty who were mid-career, holding the rank of associate professor, and faculty who were assistant professor. Having a faculty group this diverse ensured, I think, the integrity of the process and invited trust from the faculty in terms of the work we were going to do. Program prioritization is not new to higher education, although it is new to Juniata College. Stated most simply and generally, the goal of prioritization of academic programs is to align academic resources in a strategic way. It's to ensure that we are matching what a program or a department needs to sustain itself in the current moments and attending to budget, attending to how much it costs to run programs, and to really looking at the program mix that we have and considering that which students are interested in studying and that which external forces or the market seek in our students. It is not unusual in higher education to revisit curriculum and to imagine new programs and decide whether or not the current mix of programs is appropriate. And so the goal of program prioritization then really is to look at the how much it costs to run departments, how they generate resources, how they attend and meet mission, and then to use all the evidence and the data to make recommendations to the president and the provost about how to proceed. The timeline's in front of you. We knew that we needed to undertake this work this past academic year and that we had the entire academic year to complete it. So as I mentioned, the committee was established in September, and we spent a lot of time reading literature, seeing how other schools had done their work, developing our criteria. For program prioritization to work, it has to be somewhat unique to the institution, right? Because the kinds of decisions at Juniata may not be the right set of factors at another institution. We also wanted to talk about process and how we could include our faculty colleagues, and then how to weight things. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. We then needed to gather the information that was going to be the basis of our decisions, and we spent several months doing that, as you can see. In order for this process to have meaning, however, it isn't enough for a committee to work alone. So we did vet the data with the faculty. We met individually with each and every academic department, showed them the data we had gathered, invited their feedback and comment, made adjustments as necessary until we were generally in agreement with how we understood each academic department, and there are 21 at Juniata. We then turned to develop recommendations in March and in April. That was our plan all along. I should mention in this particular year, the time at which we were developing recommendations coincided with the onset of the COVID pandemic, and we then began working remotely and also with some greater urgency. We developed those recommendations in March, and in April, we went back and shared them with every academic department to let them know the preliminary recommendation as to the status of their department. We then, as a collective, shared them with the entire Board of Trustees. Also in April, they endorsed those recommendations, and we moved towards implementation, and that's where we find ourselves now. By the 1st of May, I issued a memorandum to each and every academic department indicating the implications of the recommendation that the committee had generated and what I thought it was going to mean and should mean for them practically in terms of actions to take. They are continuing to work on those recommendations to enact them all through the summer, and final decisions will be made when we resume classes in the fall semester. So what did we measure? How did we want to prioritize programs? What did we want to think about? It mattered to us to position our work with an eye to the future and what it was going to take to allow Juniata to sustain itself and actually more than sustain. The goal is to grow Juniata and be vibrant for the foreseeable future, to invite innovation and a reimagination where appropriate. To do that, we wanted to understand where there was potential for growth and where there would be interest in particular POEs for students with after they leave college and for their lives after college. We also wanted to understand our position relative to other higher education institutions, particularly in our region. Were there places where we could be seen as where certain programs could be seen as our strengths and we could command greater enrollments or perhaps lesser enrollment? So market share means how do we compare to other institutions? Market demand means what are the prospects for students after graduation? We also wanted to look at the ways in which current programs are able to generate revenue. And we understand these are surrogates, but it matters to us student interest in POEs at the time they enroll. It also matters to us how many students graduate in POEs. But beyond that, of course, not everybody seated in a class is there because they're pursuing a POE. That's the beauty and the brilliance of liberal arts education. So we wanted to look at the credit hours being generated by each department. In other words, we wanted to look at enrollment data. We did a look back for the past 5 years. And then we wanted to match the enrollment data with how much it costs to run programs and whether or not they are appropriately resourced. We went into this exercise understanding that some departments might be under-resourced and it was time to reallocate, and some, relatively speaking, might be over-resourced given enrollment shifts over time. So we looked at operating budgets, we looked at staffing levels and how much we pay faculty in the sense of faculty salary as a surrogate measure, and then the reliance on part-time faculty. How much do we pay adjuncts and overloads in order to sustain the curriculum that departments have created? And finally, but certainly not insignificantly, we can look at revenue and we can look at cost, but not in isolation of contributions to mission. And so each department submitted an efficacy report, as we called it, so that we could understand better their work and their contributions, how they contribute to the liberal arts. And also, given that this is a hallmark of Juniata, how did they contribute to experiential education or high impact practices? Because that can certainly affect staffing and enrollment. So these were our collective indicators and measures to organize our work. And I want to just share with you some of our findings. And I know this slide is colorful and perhaps a bit dizzying, but what I think it demonstrates is that while we have breadth in what students pursue, it is not evenly distributed at Juniata. When students enroll, you can see on the left side that close to half of our students are in 3 to 4 programs: biology, environmental science, business, and then they indicate health professions as they arrive. And then, as you know, health profession students distribute into various programs. So half of our students are concentrated in a small number of programs. The other half of our students are distributed throughout the balance of programs, and that doesn't change much by the time of graduation, as you can see on the right. Why does that matter? Well, it matters, I think, because so many of our students are concentrated in our signature programs, and they don't move much from the time they arrive to the time they graduate, that creates what I might describe as an inefficient distribution of labor. Half of our departments are graduating fewer than 3% of POEs in each. Still, a fifth of our graduates come from those departments. And so we certainly want to sustain and support those disciplines on campus because it matters for a fifth of our students. And yet, that maldistribution means that the allocation of resources is complicated. In other words, we have some small programs and small departments supporting several of our students, many of our students, a fifth of our students. And so how do we redistribute so that the way I describe it, I think maybe this will be helpful. It's like a listing ship, or it's like a seesaw. We want to stay in equilibrium. We want to stay in balance. And so if we move too many resources in terms of budgets from smaller departments to larger, then we'll lose those small programs. And yet we have to be very intentional about the ways in which we support those small programs, given enrollment is tending to congregate in only a few programs. And right now we are not in a place where we can grow or add faculty to the larger programs. So how do we redistribute? That was our challenge. So to decide that, it was helpful to see how many POEs were graduating, but we also needed to look at enrollment in terms of credit hours. And so there are, as you can see here, a few programs where they're generating a large number of student credit hours. That means that a lot of students are enrolled in their classes, business and biology. That's probably not a surprise. Fairly even in the middle, and then you can see a few programs on the right-hand side that aren't generating quite as many credit hours. So what do we do given this scenario? Well, the credit hour is more evenly distributed compared to the POE. I think that makes sense in a liberal art college because we want students to take electives outside of their POE. But it also suggests that we can capture greater efficiency if we rearrange the curricular offerings and streamline them a bit. So we want the breadth of student experience, we want the commitment to the liberal arts, and yet we cannot sustain all that we have been doing in the financial situation in which we find ourselves. It might be worth noting at this point that we don't have as many students given various demographic forces as we did a few years ago, yet we have kept the same number of faculty, and that is difficult for us. So how do we align those resources, again, is really the crux or the essence of what program prioritization work is about. So we thought ultimately it would be helpful to look at how much it costs to run various programs. What's the cost per student credit hour, giving you a 5-year average. And again, you can see that some of our programs are relatively more cost effective to run than our others. And that certainly informed our decision making, as did predicted employment growth. And I don't want you to hear that any one of these variables or factors made the decisions, but I would suggest to you that we looked at all of them collectively to situate our academic departments and to decide the ways in which we wanted to align resources. So the faculty committee that I described at the beginning broke each academic department into one of 3 categories. Those where we would want to enhance resources when they become available, those where we would want to sustain resources, and those where, unfortunately, we would need to curtail resources. Because we aren't in growth mode, the only way to enhance in some programs would be to curtail in others. And you can see from this chart, how do we understand enhancement? It may mean that we need additional staffing as enrollment pressures persist in those programs. It may mean that we need to renovate facilities so that we can continue to attract students, or in fact, attract additional students into programs where we can command greater market share. And it might also mean developing some new programs that will appeal to our students. In the sustain category, I think I would suggest to you this is where you will see some of our core strength in the liberal arts and our commitment to the liberal arts, and we understand that we need to shore up, we want to sustain the staffing levels in those programs. And finally, curtail does not mean eliminate. And I want to be very clear that throughout this process, we did not want to eliminate any academic discipline or any academic department. We might need to reorganize some of the academic departments. We might not be able to offer every program of emphasis. We offer roughly 80 designated POEs right now. That, I would argue, with a smaller student body, simply isn't sustainable. We have a proliferation of courses. Middle States, our accrediting body, has encouraged us on our last 2 visits to attend to that we can't continue to add individual courses given our finances and our staffing. And so curtail could mean staffing reductions as well. But I want to underscore and emphasize that in the program of emphasis system, the ability to individualize POEs remains. And so when we talked about suspending POEs, or when I then directed departments and indicated that a suspension of a designated POE was warranted, it was not to eliminate the department or the curriculum. It was to offer fewer courses. And so students, if they wanted to individualize in that field, could build a curriculum, borrow from other programs and departments, be very creative, and still be able to pursue their interests. I will tell you that the programs or the POEs that have been targeted for suspension, and only 2 have been suspended so far. Religious Studies was suspended at their request, as was Sociology. Religious Studies had 0 POEs in the current moment. And the other POEs that I identified, it's worth noting, we're averaging over the last 5 years approximately 2 POEs a year graduating. I would suggest that that's very, very difficult to sustain in the current environment of higher education, and being the urgency of that and the decisions being hastened by the pandemic but certainly not caused by them. And so again, when we suspend POEs, students who are currently enrolled will be able to graduate in them. We are not suspending a program for students who are currently enrolled. It's for future students. And again, the programs being that we're focusing upon are graduating on average 2 or fewer designated POEs a year. And so now you'll see where the departments, where we place the recommendations. And so in the enhanced category, some staffing pressures, some enrollment pressures, and some potential for growth. In the sustained category, we've been able to match resources to student interest. We've been able to keep class sizes where we would like. And you'll note that a few of those departments have asterisks. I would say that those departments recently experienced a curtailment in terms of a staffing reduction. We do not want any further curtailment. So we want to note that what it means to be sustained is to sustain them at the level they found themselves in the spring of 2020. And then finally, you'll see that we did in fact recommend curtailing resources for several departments. That could mean a suspension of a POE. It might mean staffing reductions, and we are looking to reorganize some programs with the hope that that reorganization will invite and allow for some innovation and perhaps some new program growth. In closing, I want to note that program prioritization processes are challenging. They are on every college campus, and I appreciate that. The decisions that we made, while I think necessary, weren't easy. And in fact, in some cases, I understand that they are painful. But I want to recognize the work of the faculty committee, who I think were thoughtful, conscientious, and very purposefully adopted a breadth of perspective and tried to understand not just what was best for individual programs, individual departments, but for academic affairs as a whole, and what would position us to be able to remain vibrant as a college, to be able to weather the economic pressures that we're experiencing in higher education, given the demographic changes, and those pressures certainly have been hastened by the pandemic. And so to align resources in a way that will allow us to retain our identity and our integrity as a liberal arts college, while also positioning us for growth in the future. I appreciate your time and your attention. And if you have any questions about what you've heard, don't hesitate to reach out to me via email. Thank you so much.